Keith Raniere, leader of the self-help group NXIVM, has been accused of using meditation and mindfulness exercises as tools of mind control, with members being encouraged to surrender their critical thinking and autonomy. This situation sits at odds with these practices' long history and many documented benefits in religious and modern health settings. And in the cult world, the NXIVM example is far from being unique. In this video, we'll examine what happens when mindfulness stops being a tool for self-awareness and instead becomes a measuring stick of devotion and a tool of control. Hi, I'm Renee, and I've started this channel to use it as a platform to discuss cult topics and to offer some simple art therapy activities that can support recovery from high control environments. In my last video, I covered a brief history of mindfulness, some of the different ways it can be practiced, and the positive aspects associated with it. Today, we'll peek into the dark side of mindfulness, in which I'll share some of my personal experiences and consider how something so good can become so bad in culty situations. And then we'll finish off with how it fits into art therapy in ways other than Zentangling. This video contains discussion of coercive control, which may be distressing for some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. In my last video, I described my experience with a meditation practice known as Vipassana. Vipassana sits somewhere in between traditional mindfulness practices and holistic New Age wellness because it's generally considered to be a secular practice since it doesn't require dedication to a particular belief system. It usually begins with focusing on the breath or bodily sensations, training the mind to remain steady and present. Over time, attention is expanded to observe how thoughts, feelings, and sensations continually rise and pass away. The tradition I experienced was based on S.N. Goenka, and through video teachings of this guru, we were told that everything was interconnected and impermanent. We were encouraged to reach a state of equilibrium by cleansing ourselves of sankharas. These were described to us as being deep-rooted mental conditioning, the residual traces of craving, aversion, and unresolved emotions. Goenka framed them as literal impurities stored in the body-mind system, a point I want to return to a little bit later. For many people, Vipassana has a positive effect and is related to the benefits of mindfulness such as life satisfaction, agreeableness, conscientiousness, vitality, self-esteem, empathy, sense of autonomy, competence, and increased optimism. And with such an amazing legacy and beneficial claims, surely everyone should be doing mindfulness, right? As it turns out, it's not that simple. Mindfulness is not for everyone. The same paper that I just mentioned also points out that studies in mindfulness have been associated with depression, neuroticism, absent-mindedness, dissociation, rumination, cognitive reactivity, social anxiety, difficulties in emotional regulation, experiential avoidance, and increased negative experiences of delusion in the context of psychosis. In short, the reason why not everyone has positive experiences with mindfulness is because personal histories, mental health conditions, and individual differences can make certain practices overwhelming or even harmful rather than calming and beneficial. In some respects, I learned this lesson the hard way. I persevered through 10 days of Vipassana in the hope that by the end of it, I would experience bliss, because I was going on the assumption that if it worked for other people so well, then it would work for me too. In the lead up to the retreat, I had half-heartedly tried meditation myself, but it never really worked. I thought it was just me, that I wasn't doing it right. But after having given it a good crack and following all the Vipassana guidelines, and also subsequently studying a lot of psychology and mental health, I realised no, it was just a me thing. But I have also discovered methods of mindfulness that do work for me. And I think that's really the moral of the story. Mindfulness, it is a good thing, and Vipassana, that is great and works wonderful for some people. But mindfulness practices aren't a one-size-fits-all. My experience with Vipassana also quite subtly alerted me to ways in which meditation and mindfulness practices could be weaponized. What happened was, after the first 2 days of the retreat, I developed intense back pain. And so I took the opportunity when I could to speak to one of the teachers, and I explained that I had a benign tumour in my uterus known as a fibroid, and that I just could not sit cross-legged like that all day, every day. To my surprise, their initial reaction was to push back and to tell me that my pain was actually caused by the sankaras and that I needed to suffer through it to be released. When I heard that, a wave of terror went through me. My physical pain was being invalidated. Fortunately, that's not where it ended, and I did finish up being given back support. To their credit, Vipassana centres acknowledge that the practice isn't for everyone, and they do conduct a basic screening process. But ultimately, facilitators are not doctors or mental health professionals, and the system relies on participants disclosing their histories and teachers taking these seriously. Now, since my videos have a cult focus, I want to be quite clear here. I'm not trying to criticise Vipassana or imply that it is a cult, because I don't think that at all. And if I applied my 12 criteria for assessing high control groups, which is available on my website, Vipassana would score very low. I do not think that it's a dangerous group at all. And I know many people have benefited from these courses, and I've even made some lasting friendships through the experience myself. The sad reality is, however, that not all practitioners of meditation have the same awareness of ethics. This means that in less scrupulous settings, cults and high control groups can take mindfulness practices and twist them into tools for manipulation, obedience, and control. While this could happen in traditional Buddhist or Hindu practices, or even in contemporary mental health therapies, I suspect it's more likely to occur in unregulated wellness and holistic healing. But don't quote me on that, because that's something that really needs more formal research to confirm. So in general terms, in high control groups, mindfulness can be weaponized when it's framed to subtly pressure participants into compliance. You might hear phrases like empty your mind of all doubts, or let go of worldly attachments completely, or feel into the resistance to resolve karma. These might sound like spiritual guidance, but in practice, especially when combined with behaviours that reduce autonomy, they discourage questioning or critical thinking. Members may be encouraged to meditate excessively, stay silent, and suppress discomfort, creating the sense that any doubt or unease is a moral flaw. In some groups, mindfulness exercises are directly tied to ideology, suggesting that peace or clarity is only achieved by perfectly following the leader and the rules that are set. This transforms a tool for self-awareness into a tool for control, using silence, repetition, and rigid rules to cultivate obedience. Spiritual language often reinforces this dynamic. Terms like energy blockages or karma purification or spiritual toxins may sound profound, yet there's no scientific evidence for them to be taken as literal forces. Coercive groups can take advantage of this by framing suffering, doubt, or mental distress as a spiritual deficiency rather than a natural psychological or physiological response. They can also induce guilt, fear, or inadequacy, pressuring members to strictly follow rituals in order to correct themselves. In contrast, contemporary mindfulness practices frame these experiences through the nervous system, and things like racing thoughts, tension, or emotional surges that are understood to be normal responses, not moral failings. Viewing mindfulness this way makes it safer, evidence-based, and supportive of well-being. Even practices that seem benign, like yoga, can be misused in high demand groups. Postures and breathing exercises may be presented as ways to align your energy with the leader's vision or release past karmic sins, emphasising spiritual effects over physiological ones. Unfortunately, participants might be encouraged to persist through discomfort, reinforcing obedience rather than self-care. Contemporary approaches such as somatic psychotherapy understand the body as storing past experiences, especially trauma, but it's not quite in the same way as the Sankaras. Yoga can gently release tension from stress, but without proper guidance, it can also trigger dissociation, panic, or somatic flashbacks. Imagine someone in a high control group performing intense back bends while being told that discomfort is merely resistance to spiritual energy. If that person has a trauma history, these exercises could exacerbate symptoms rather than promote healing. A key safeguard is understanding the nervous system. Techniques like breath work, body scans, or yoga can elicit responses ranging from calm to anxiety, or even dissociation, depending on individual history. Recognising these signals allows participants to pause, modify exercises, or seek support, turning mindfulness from a rigid prescription into something a bit more flexible and evidence-based. Neurodiversity also adds another layer of complexity. Differences in sensory processing, emotional regulation, and cognition mean that practices like long meditations, structured breathing, or intense yoga may help some, but it could just as easily overwhelm someone else. For example, a person with ADHD may struggle to focus, or someone with PTSD may experience flashbacks or panic, or a person on the autism spectrum may be overstimulated by routines or sensory input. And someone with schizophrenia may see a worsening of psychotic symptoms if mindfulness is applied without professional oversight. High control groups rarely account for these differences, often presenting rigid routines as being universally beneficial. Whereas trauma-informed, neurodiverse aware approaches prioritise safety, choice and self-regulation over spiritual dogma. The bottom line is that mindfulness is not universally beneficial. The type of practice, its intensity, and timing in a person's life make all the difference. Safe mindfulness requires guidance from teachers and professionals who understand mental health, trauma, and neurodiversity. And so I do want to stress mindfulness is a great tool for awareness and self-regulation, but it's just not a cure-all. And respecting individual differences, monitoring the nervous system responses, and seeking qualified support if any issues arise can make the practice safer and better for everyone. Recovering from coercive cults and high control groups can feel like navigating a minefield of potential triggers. For some, structured mindfulness practices such as meditation, yoga, or Zentangling offer genuine healing and support emotional regulation. But for those whose trauma involved these very practices, and this can even include weaponized prayer circles or purification rituals, being told to return to these sorts of practices can be counterproductive. Trauma-informed therapy, especially from practitioners who understand cult dynamics, recognise this. A client-centred approach that adapts interventions to the individual with sensitivity to time, place and personal history is essential. Take Zentangling, for example. In my last video, I showed how it can encourage calm and focus, but not even this is foolproof. I began a larger piece in my sketchbook, only to grow frustrated when the pen bled through the paper and the task felt overwhelming. Instead of forcing it, I stopped, choosing self-awareness over perfection. That sort of choice is mindfulness in action. While traditional practices rely on routine and repetition, like what I've said, meditation, yoga, tai chi, or even mandalas, I often find that free creative play without rules or expectations is just as powerful. Novelty can spark presence, helping me reconnect to the moment in a way that feels safe and authentic. And that is what this week's art therapy prompt is all about. Mindful art play. As always, remember our self-guided art therapy guidelines of creating a safe space with no distractions. Focus on the process, not the product. Keep the artwork and the reflection private unless it is safe to share, and respecting your own boundaries. If it stops being calming, then listen to your own inner nudges and don't force yourself to continue. For this activity, I'm recommending watercolour paints or something like that. If you don't have these, then you can use your imagination. You can water down acrylic paints, use food dye, or even coffee water, or any other creative medium you can think of. I'm going to demonstrate a few different ways you might like to approach this activity. The first is similar to the process I used for my front cover. I started with wetting the page. Then I applied watercolour paints. But rather than being decorative, this is purely for fun and mindfulness. Taking the time to simply be in the moment, watching the colours spread, blend and shift. I found this deeply relaxing. For this piece, I decided I want to experiment a bit, so I added some salt. The table salt didn't seem to be doing too much, so I switched to larger crystals, which worked beautifully, and I really enjoyed watching them soak up the colours of the paints. You know that sarcastic saying about something being as exciting as watching paint dry? Well, in this case, it really was enjoyable. Watching paint dry can become a mindfulness practice in itself. Although, to be honest, I didn't watch this fully dry because it took several hours. And so it wasn't until the next day that I collected the coloured salt because I had an idea for trying something new. What I did on another page was I started by wetting it and then I sprinkled the salts on top to see if they would release the pigment that they had absorbed in the previous picture. And much to my delight, that is exactly what happened. For my third playful activity, I painted circles by inking the rim of a container and stamping it on the page, then filling each one with water to make the colour spread. I enjoyed layering different tones and overlapping the shapes to see how all the hues changed. Once I'd finished and this was dry, I decided to go back over it and fill it in with more circles. This was inspired by Zentangling. To me, mindfulness doesn't always need repetitive structure. In all these little experiments, simply playing with paint sharpened my awareness of the present. Granny Garnet also has some ideas on how mindful practice doesn't need to be formally structured too.
My dears, gather close and I'll tell you a little tale. I like to be mindful, you see, but not always like the monk in the forest, sitting still as a broomstick, eyes closed, waiting for peace to arrive. Sometimes I find mindfulness in the quiet rhythm of my needle. I have an old apron, faded and patched from years of baking and planting, and I like to embroider tiny flowers along its hem, one stitch at a time. I watch the thread wind through the fabric, up and down, over and under, like a little river flowing where I want it to go. With every loop, I feel my breath slowing, my mind softening. The worries of the day, whether the hens are fed or the kettle is left on, slip quietly aside. Sometimes, while I embroider, I pretend the flowers are not just on my apron, but dancing in the garden all around me. The daisies sway, the marigolds nod, and I am there with them, fully present. The world and I stitched together for a moment, one careful stitch at a time. So, whether it's stitching an apron, drawing a pattern, or simply listening to the wind in the trees, you can practice mindfulness. The secret, my dears, is simply to pay attention. One stitch, one line, one breath at a time.
Not only are these activities a great way to practice mindfulness in the moment, but looking back over them afterwards can be just as mindful. Tracing the shapes with my eyes and recalling the hues in my mind's eye brings a quiet appreciation of the process. Mindfulness is often described as a kind of mental training, a way to unlearn old habits of reactivity and develop greater freedom in how we respond to life. To me, it feels both simple and profound. Sitting quietly, observing what arises, and slowly beginning to see oneself and the world with fresh eyes. That said, mindfulness should never come with pressure. For some people, it naturally unfolds through meditation, yoga, or Zangtangling, or even tapestry, and with practice they can grow more skilled and comfortable over time. For me, mindfulness works best when it's flexible, woven into different activities rather than locked into rigid routines. Some days, Zangtangling brings calm. Other days, simply noticing the sights, sounds and scents around me is enough. I often weave Zangtangle-inspired pattern making into my art therapy practice. The repetition of shapes and lines, the rhythms of painting and drawing helps quiet my thoughts and invites presence. At other times, mindfulness emerges through entirely different creative explorations, mixing colours, layering textures, or just experimenting with patterns. Ultimately, mindfulness is a personal journey. There's no single formula. What matters is finding what fits you, honouring your own uniqueness and learning to be present in whatever way life allows, from each breath and each encounter to every fleeting moment of beauty. With all of that in mind, groups and gurus that insist that mindfulness is anything different, that it involves surrendering self completely and losing oneself in accordance to someone else's manipulation, should be seen as red flags. What's your experience with mindfulness? Do structured, repetitive activities like meditation, yoga, or Zangtangling help you? Do you have any other creative ways to do mindfulness that you could share with others? If so, please let us know in the comments. The activities and opinions expressed in this video are for educational purposes only and are not a substitute for professional therapy. If any of the topics covered today stirred strong emotions, please practice self-care and seek professional guidance as needed.